So I would like very much to welcome Ladislav Jackson here at Virginia Tech. We're very pleased to have Ladislav join us and share his latest research with us. Dr. Ladislav Jackson is an art and architecture historian, a faculty member and a vice dean at the Faculty of Fine Arts, Brno University of Technology. He teaches courses on 20th century art, architecture, and design history, and his research focuses on East Central European architectural modernism. Since 2016, he's researched the life and the work of Jaroslav Polivka, if I'm pronouncing that right, and particularly from a global perspective. And in the last 8 years, he's been incredibly prolific. He counts 20 books, edited books, co-edited books on architecture and design history. Between 2016 and 2017, he was a Fulbright visiting researcher at UC Berkeley, and he also specializes in feminist and queer history of visual culture. So his lecture today has a very intriguing title, What Exactly Was Raumplan, and has there been one after Adolf Loos? And many of you in the audience will be very familiar with the spatial qualities of Loos's Raumplan, but here I think we'll learn something about the way in which ideas and these kinds of innovations are explained, rationalized, reproduced between architects and future generations. So please jot down any questions that you have during Ladislav's talk, and we would like to invite you afterwards to either raise your digital hand or place your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll invite you to put them directly to Ladislav in video, or we can read the questions to him. So Aaron, I think, would like to say a few brief warm words of welcome as well. So I'll pass it to Aaron, who can then pass it to Ladislav to give his lecture.
Thank you, Joseph. I am not sure what else I could add. You gave a good resume of his resume. I have to say it is intimidating that Dr. Jackson seems to produce at the level at which he does so consistently and across such a variety of different areas of inquiry. For those of us that have been writing for a while, it's just both inspirational and intimidating. I first got to know Dr. Jackson, Zygmunt Lender, as a researcher, in fact, in the area of queer and gender studies as they relate to architecture, but also as an expert on Czech and Slovakian architecture, in which he's done some absolutely remarkable work. And he expanded his interest towards the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and other American architects during his Fulbright visit. And we were very happy to be able to encourage that at the School of Architecture at Taliesin. I get a sense that he is now engaging in some syncretic work that I hope will bring together several of the strands of his previous research. And so I very much look forward to what he has to say. And with that, I'm very happy to give the word to Dr. Jackson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introductions. So first, thank you for all for attending this matinee, which sounds more bougie than just a lecture at noon. So let's call it that. I would like to thank Aaron and Joseph for having me here and for arranging this and for all these lovely introductions, which I don't really deserve, but thank you anyway. Today, I would like to talk a bit about Adolf Loos, a very prominent and significant figure of the 20th century European architecture. But before I do so, let me share my screen first, sorry. There we go. There we go. So, but before I do so, I would like to say two things. First, I would like to thank to my dear colleague, Jana Kořínková from the Department of Art History at Brno University of Technology, my faculty fellow, who did an amazing research on Adolf Loos in past couple of years. and who discussed with me over endless lunches and coffees many of my hypotheses on Loss's architecture, which I'm about to share with you today. She gave me a valuable feedback and shared many interesting archival documents with me, which I will mention later. So many credits for what I'm about to present today go to her. Secondly, while I choose to offer this talk on Adolf Loos, we cannot overlook the controversies that surround Adolf Loos's work and life. His controversial published articles openly express unacceptable views and viewpoints, such as misogyny, sexism, racism, patriarchy, colonialism, and furthermore, we cannot forget Loos's trial for molesting underage girls, which at the end he was acquitted of. However, the process of investigation and trials in pedophile cases were very biased back then. Rich guys covering for other rich guys. This is something we cannot simply dismiss, and we cannot try to separate the architectural work that he left us from its creator, his biography, and his life choices. However, I'm not going to talk about Loos's life. I'm going to talk about the buildings that he left us and the legacy that other people and other architects and theorists refer to. So I will more talk about Loos's second life than his actual life and his actual biography, but we still cannot dismiss that. Architectural historian Christopher Long, whom I will mention again shortly, published an exquisite book reconstructing Loos's trial, how it shaped Loos's later public image, how it was reflected in interwar Vienna, and what was the period context of cases like this. So if you're interested more in this, which I strongly encourage you to, you can find it in this book. With all that said, let me jump into the issue of Raumplan, which we will talk about today. What it was, what it wasn't, how was it reflected by later architects, and how does it speak to us today? The talk has 5 parts. First, I would like to give you an overlook on some reflections on the concept of Raumplan, how it has been constructed in the first place, and how it has been reflected in architectural historiography later. Then I would like to go deeper into 2 very inspirational researches conducted recently on the topic of Raumplan after Loos by 2 amazing colleagues. Then I would like to look closer on 2 projects by Heinrich Kulka and Kurt Unger that have been so far omitted from the recent reflections on the Raumplan legacy. Then I would like to briefly point out one important notion, the practical aspect of designing the Raumplan, the commonplace in Loos's studio, if you will. And in the final part, I would like to come up with some alternate terms for Raumplan after Loos, what happened to Raumplan after Loos's death. So let's get to it. Architectural historian Christopher Long, in his latest publication, Adolf Loos, The Last Houses, which is an expanded version of a chapter in his book, The New Space, admits that Raumplan was not a concept that Adolf Loos would name or define. As Long points out, Loos made a single note in a single article published in Frankfurter Zeitung. I will mention this article several times later. In this article, Loos claimed that he was trying to, quote, loosen the boundaries between the rooms and place them in space, not on the same floor. This is a great revolution in architecture, the loosening of the floor plan into space, end quote. Because the focus on the original Long's book was on spatial experience and movement in home spaces created by Viennese architects of Loos's time, Long later referred to Raumplan just for its movement and experience qualities. Quote, the rooms are lined up in such a way that they lead the visitor along a deliberately marked route full of visually impressive and surprising transitions, as if absolutely nothing was left to chance, end quote. That's what Christopher Long writes about Raumplan. However, the term Raumplan was introduced in a monograph on Loos written by Heinrich Kulka, his successor and close collaborator, in 1931. A separate chapter in Kulka's text is dedicated to the Raumplan, numbering about 1.5 press pages. According to Kulka, Loos embodied in his top residential architecture, quote, the freedom to think 3-dimensionally, and place rooms differently without having to tie to a certain floor, and to create mutually communicating spaces harmoniously interconnected in one invisible and space-saving unit, end quote. Kulka proves him right in the qualities of economy of losses solution. The living space, which is not divided into floors, is undoubtedly more impressive, but it can hardly be identified as being more rational in normal operation. At the expense of floor-planned houses, Kulka writes that, quote, the routes to move around the house are inevitably longer. The operation of the house is therefore less efficient and more expensive, living conditions worse, and the whole building more expensive and requiring more maintenance costs, end quote. However, the rationality of the space can be successfully doubted in the case of Lawes's living spaces, designed according to the Raumplan principles, in terms of the number of stairs, the area of roads, consumption of building and decorative materials. The spatial discipline that Kulka writes about in relation to Raumplan is the exact opposite of what Lawes stages in front of and around the visitor. German art historian Josef Imorde quite rightly disputes Kulka's conclusions about the economization of construction through the spatial plan, quote. Of course, one had to ask in disbelief, was Kulka's claim about building economics realistic at all? Is it really true that a house with a floor plan is cheaper than one without a floor plan? Did the use of the cubic shape play any role for the economy at all? And were there complicated sequences of levels really cheaper than uniform concrete ceilings, end quote. The ideals of rationalization, which the Lawes discourse constructed around his most significant family houses projects, were able to convince even some of the pioneering avant-garde designers and thinkers. In his texts dedicated to Lawes, written by a Czech leftist theorist, Karel Tajge, he highlights several qualities, but not the economization, which was the ideal of the avant-garde. The first of the advantages mentioned by Tajge is Lawes's design of terrace cascades, which Lawes designed at Villa Shoy and later at Tristan Tzara's house. Quote, Lawes did not want to orient European houses anymore than Wright wanted to contaminate the American houses with Japanese ideals. Lawes did not see anything exotic in the terraces he used. The possibility of walking out of the bedroom, the living room, or the bathroom to a terrace open to the sun and air, or even designed as a garden, is understandable in the Orient, Tunisia, as well as the Riviera, Prague, Vienna, or Paris, end quote. On the other hand, Tajge saw in Lawes's interiors something anachronistic and contradictory to the ideas which Lawes preached. Quote, his motto, beauty matters, or the cult of valuable material, is ultimately an expression of outdated aesthetics. Lawes's buildings are not significant because of their courage and invention in design. Lawes probably understood marble better than he understood reinforced concrete. The furnishings of his interiors, whether selected or designed, were ideally suited to the human scale, the symptom of practicality and comfort, and yet their interiors are dust catchers, end quote. According to Tajge, Lawes, however, significantly contributed to the housing reform. Tajge quoted Lawes's remarks almost literally from the interview published in the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1929, including Lawes's own reference to Immanuel Kant's perception of space, and went on to emphasize Tristan Tzara's house. In this project, Lawes, quote, divided the rooms into different levels. I emphasize levels, not floors, and thus achieved space reductions and the provision of small spaces in relatively large rooms, end quote. And yet again, Tajge emphasized the access to the cascade of terraces, which apparently is something that he really admired in Lawes's work. Taiga had partial reservations about Loss's conception of living space as anachronism. Younger, leftist avant-garde architect Karel Honzík provided a sophisticated criticism of Loss's approach about 6 years after Loss's death in 1939. His essay, Sloh odívání, The Style of Dressing, which was published in his book Tvorba životního slohu, The Creation of a Lifestyle, after World War II in 1946, conceived of a left-wing architect's response to a series of feuilletons written by Loss himself on the analogy of architecture and clothing. In his texts, Loss argued that good architecture should be like a well-tailored modern suit that should fit its wearer well, but at the same time be tailored from the best and most durable materials. Thus, according to Loss, a comfortable living space should have been designed. However, Honzík replies, quote, against fashion, which seeks to emphasize personal and class exclusivity, against this fashion, which was supported by a liberalist capitalism for its commercial purposes, we want to build a folk style of dress based on the real needs of the broadest consuming class, end quote. Loss's emphasis on luxury, the spatial arrangement of the representative part of the house, the incorporation of artistic and handcraft elements, a visual spectacle which perfectly designed proportions and their mutual relations, was anything what would Honzík imagine under his term folk style for the broadest classes. Social criticism of Loss's Raumplan was eventually provided by the iconic text by architectural historian Beatrice Colomina, titled Split Wall Domestic Voyeurism, originally part of her book Sexuality and Space, and later developed in Colomina's book Privacy and Publicity. Colomina deals with the criticism of Raumplan from a feminist perspective. She asks how Loss's non-traditional solution of a living space, which Kulka started to call Raumplan, forms and reproduces the power relations of control inside the house, mainly on two axes, visitor and host, and male inhabitant and female inhabitant. According to Colomina, Loss's architecture is not just experienced. Loss refers to the inhabitant as the observer. His definition of architecture is, in fact, the definition of theatrical architecture. The tension between the feeling of comfort and comfort as a control disrupts the position of the house as a traditional form of representation, as Colomina explains. Theatrical boxes served for the theatrical spectacle in the living space, which Colomina identified as the observation boxes in Moller and Miller Villa. Moller Villas in Vienna and Miller's Villa is at the outskirts of Prague, are referred to as feminine, where the domestic concept of furniture contrasted with the adjunct masculine space, the library. Here, leather armchairs, a table, a fireplace, and mirrors represent the public space inside the house. The office and the club enter the domestic interior. In this respect, according to Colomina, the house project for a dancer Josephine Baker is the most radical. Baker's body, as the owner of the house, is conceived as an object of a sexualized gaze. The house itself is a spectacle, eroticized system of views and power, of course. If it was said that Loss's architecture undeniably has some distinctive, original, and inventive characteristics, which are expressed mainly in his concept of a domestic interior as a composition and sequence of spaces, in which he rejects floors and prefers functional levels and zones, all in combinations of expensive and carefully selected materials, and everything framed in expensive luxury. And at the same time, there were critical voices that spoke against this concept. The fundamental question opens up. Was it a unique thinking and a creative gesture of a single man, or can we talk about the Raumplan, the spatial planning, even after Loss? Recently, two researchers, architectural historians, have addressed this issue. Iris Meder and more recently, Tanja Poppel-Reuter. However, do their texts provide satisfactory answers? The architectural historian Iris Meder, in her groundbreaking and rich and extensible dissertation called Open Worlds, the Vienna School and the Construction of Family Houses between 1910 to 1938, first defines several important schools, metaphorical and institutional, and their different conception of the residential house designs. Among the institutional background and its leading representatives, she mentions Karl Koenig at the Technische Hochschule, Otto Wagner at the Kunstakademie, Josef Hoffmann at the Kunstgewerbeschule, and Camillo Sitte at the Staatsgewerbeschule. We will be particularly interested in the circle of the Adolf Loos School, where Meder pays separate attention to Jacques Groac, Paul Engelmann, Heinrich Kulka, Helmut Wagner, Freinsheim, Ernst Freud, and Ernst Frommer. She writes about the open reflections of Raumplan, mainly in relation to Engelmann and Kulka. She explains this thesis on an example of Vladimir Miller's villa in Olomouc, designed by Paul Engelmann, quote. So there is no doubt about Raumplan using three-dimensionality in the sense of Loos. Hanging the ceiling only attempts to dramatically multiply the famous gradation of space, end quote. Unlike Loos, however, Engelmann suppressed the movement dimension in his interior design. In the passage dedicated to Kulka, who was a key figure in the construction and second life of Raumplan, Meder discusses Kulka's collaboration with Loos, the modes of operation of Loos's Viennese office under Kulka's leadership, and then interprets Kulka's independent projects in the Czech lands, which is mainly the Teichner's mountain house in Spičák and Holzner's villa in Hronov, which we can see on the right image. In the latter case, Meder states that the spatial effect is similar to that one of the Adolf Loos's houses, but it is slightly freer and resembles the late Austrian houses of Ernst Anton Plischke. In the case of Kulka, Iris Meder was aware of a certain shift from the elaborate spatial concept of Adolf Loos, represented by his villas like Villa Moller, Villa Miller, or Tristan Tzara's house. On the one hand, it indicates the need for a certain update and coping with the achievements of the architectural avant-garde to which Kulka was opposed to, but at the same time, he could not ignore some of the new principles and selectively accepted them. On the other hand, Meder shows that Raumplan needed to be tamed precisely because of a certain spatial uneconomicity and impracticality. She points out that Raumplan occupied a smaller part of the house in Kulka's designs than it occupied in Loos's designs, at the expense of traditional floors and traditionally separated rooms. In the case of Kantor's villa in Jablonec, which we can see here, Meder notes the following, quote, "The entrance floor and mezzanine floor are designed as a continuum of the Raumplan, while the two upper floors have separate floors or separate floor plans," end quote. For example, in the case of Josef Weisser's villa in Schumperk, which I don't have a picture of, I'm sorry, by Loos's pupil Helmut Wagner Freinsheim, Meder claims that in an effort to combine Loos's Raumplan and functionalist horizontalism, he achieved similar results to those found in the Richard Neutra and Rudolf Schindler's projects. Meder also notices that Loos's students and successors often developed the concept of Raumplan, especially in those houses where they design the building sitting on a slope, which made it possible to connect the multi-level living space to the immediate surroundings of the house. The question of whether Raumplan was after Loos and what it looked like and how it has changed was recently asked by another architectural historian, Tanja Poppel-Reuter, who had the opportunity to study documents in Kulka's archive, both in Albertina, which has not been accessible for a couple of years now, and she was also able to study less available collections and texts related to Kulka's life in New Zealand. So connecting these two complicated, accessible archival documents is kind of unique in her research. Popple-Reuter highlights the fact that Kulka did not differentiate between understanding Loss's work and his own work, which creates an unquestionable contradiction because they differ greatly from each other in many respects. She writes, quote, Kulka's perception of Raumplan is ambiguous and represents only a few aspects of what Loss's spatial designs entailed. In addition, Kulka's publications in the 1930s were primarily based on factual descriptions aimed primarily to convince the readers of the economic viability of the Raumplan idea, end quote. A certain version of Colomina's domestic voyeurism can also be found in Cantor's villa and Semler's residence. Quote, the homeowner, a doctor, could easily observe the entrance to watch patients arrive. And in the Semler residence, the homeowner could similarly monitor the entry and arrival of guests. The window allowed the owner to see who was at the door without being seen. So the architect gave the hosts control of the entrance and supervision on what was happening there, end quote. Popple-Reuter concludes her study by cautiously stating that Kulka's between the designs in Europe, and especially in the Czech lands alone, and the post-war work in New Zealand, he underwent an unquestionable development, which was related to the gradual independence from Loss's methods and refinement of what is productive from Loss's spatial thinking and what is not. Quote, Kulka's designs were neither completely independent of Loss, nor were they copies of Loss's designs. Its contribution to Loss's Raumplan can be seen in its ability to implement, adapt, and improve it, Tanja Popple-Reuter concludes. Now, I will show how all this knowledge about the origin and reflection of Loss's Raumplan can be seen in two projects designed by Heinrich Kulka and Kurt Unger, another close collaborator and successor of Adolf Loss. And both of these projects are not addressed by Iris Meder or Tanja Popple-Reuter in their researches or in their texts. The first realization is Kurt Jehuda Unger's villa for his parents in Sokolov, number 272. The local historian Michael Rund recently wrote about it. Rund devoted only a relatively limited space to the interpretation of the architectural concept of the building when he wrote, quote, towards the street, the living room, the space with the highest headroom, was connected to the lower vestibule or the lobby. This space was followed by a higher positioned dining room with a lower clear height. Access to the bedrooms was possible through the dining room or a side staircase from the lobby. All living spaces were situated southeast of the garden. Only kitchens, offices, and auxiliary spaces are located on the northwest side of the street. The office space had a separate access. Unger himself said, "This was my best house I had ever built, even though it wasn't typical," end quote. Unger's reflection on Loss's principles is not nearly as extensive as that of the Kulkas. Unger published a single article in the annual issue of Bauwelt magazine, Bauwelt Journal. The article included Unger's comments on joint projects with Adolf Loss. In the text, for example, Unger recalls the story of a debate between Loss and Unger's uncle, when Loss spoke in favor of using opaque cathedral windows. However, Unger's uncle objected, quote, "But I couldn't see anything out of the windows, nothing from the beautiful city garden." Oscar Wilde said that the gentleman isn't supposed to be staring out of the windows, was Loss's answer, end quote. In this regard, we can find some inconsistencies in the approach of Kulka and Unger. While in Semler's residence and Cantor's villa, designed by Kulka, Tanja Popple-Reuter recognized a clear moment of control from the inside of the house. In Unger's Sokolov project, we find nothing like this, simply because all living spaces face southeast into the garden, and the facade to the street has only 2 small windows. And yet, we can't find anything like this here, even though the house included a law firm office, where the master of the house would appreciate an overview of incoming visits and clients at least as much as the Dr. Alfred Kantor in Jablonec. In 1937, a detailed article about Ungar's Sokolov realization was published in the German magazine Monat, the month. It is not signed. It takes the form of a report on the project, so it can be assumed that the author was Ungar himself. The author describes the living space of the house as follows, quote, "This main room is followed by a higher, lower open dining room. Towards the ground floor, the living room is connected to a small and low lobby at the street level, through which the apartment is entered. The effect of the vastness of the living space, which is by no means oversized, is suppressed by the lower lobby and the adjoining low dining room," end quote. The private rooms in Ungar's project were located upstairs and were accessible through the living area, through the living room and the raised dining room. The floor was accessible by a separate service staircase. Ungar did not connect himself to laws as vehemently and explicitly as Kulka. However, it is quite symptomatic that he puts a quotation from Loss's article from the Frankfurter Zeitung, which we heard already twice before, which was later reprinted in the magazine Trotzdem, right to his description of the Sokolov project, exactly where he writes about the dimensions and sequence of the living part of the house. Unlike the Loss villas, which usually stand alone in the garden and are usually transverse to the street, Ungar's house is a longitudinal building in the urban street row and is parallel to the street. Thus, Ungar had to adapt the internal layout of his version of Raumplan. The spaces were arranged around a longitudinal axis, which reduced the dynamism, so the visitor had to travel longer distances when moving from one level to another. At the same time, the architect did not provide him with diagonal interlevel views as in Loss's houses. The side service staircase, which in Loss's designs of the houses with Raumplan was on the axis with the successive vertical sequence in the living space, and which provided the possibility of fast vertical communication, was not located in the case of Ungar's house as behind the Raumplan, respectively in front of the Raumplan, but next to it, which also reduced the dynamism and the dynamic communication in the house. Ungar's version of the Raumplan also worked better for the Sokolov project because, as Iris Mäder also pointed out for other houses, the house stands on a slope. The passage through the house, through the Raumplan, from the street to the garden level, balances the lower street level and the higher garden level, which is accessible from the dining room, the highest point of the Raumplan sequence, through the winter garden. During his emigration from Austria, after the Austrian annexation by Nazi Germany, Heinrich Kulka and his wife and their son Richard made a clear choice to go to Hradec Králové in northeast Bohemia. In 1926, Kulka married Hilda Beranová, whose family lived in Hradec Králové at the time. Beranová was a direct relative of Erna Levenbach, born Beranová, the mother of textile entrepreneur businessman Karl Levenbach, originally from Hronov. So you can see that all these places are sort of connected. Levenbach also became Kulka's only known client during his temporary stay in Hradec Králové, when he ordered the construction of an apartment building with his own generously designed businessman's apartment. Levenbach House, number 906 in Hradec Králové, was to contain 6 garages, a boiler room, a laundry room, and the caretaker's apartment on the lower ground floor. Upstairs was 1 2-room, 1 ordinary 3-room, and 1 non-standard 3-room apartment, which can be described as the main one, the apartment for the Levenbach's family, with a hint of the Raumplan effect. Thanks to the fact that Kulka raised the ceiling level of the entrance hall, which we can see the entrance in the middle. So he raised the ceiling level of this entrance hall on the ground floor. He had the opportunity to reduce the clear height of the room on the first floor, located directly above it. There were 2 accesses to the room, with the bathroom by 3 steps. Here we can see the floor plan. So there were 2 accesses to the room with the bathroom by 3 steps, which allowed him to develop at least a hint of a multi-level dynamics. The rectangular hall was followed by a living room, which was separated from the hall by a railing with 2 columns. However, Kulka gave up Loss's belief or Loss's idea that the space can be divided by moldings, tiles, wallpapers, or the texture of the floor covering. The public spaces of the apartment follow each other smoothly and without any optical separation. Only the operational part, like kitchen, the pantry, the maid's room, is separated, and the private part with the bedroom and the bathroom is elevated. Other apartments on the same and on higher floors do not use any of these effects. However, at the time, Kulka also reflected not only Loss's legacy, which he simplified for the projects of a small cottage, country villa, or an apartment house, but also to other contemporary discussions on minimal dwelling. He placed 2 studios with kitchens on the 2nd and the 3rd floor, in the equipment of which the influence of a sectoral minimal furniture by Jan Vaněk, who was main furniture designer for Adolf Loos, certainly manifested itself. However, Kulka was very vigilant about avant-garde principles, and although he simplified and modernized his concept of Raumplan to better match the proclamations of economy, he resisted the ideal of a glass-paneled, smooth facade as a symptom of the international style. Kulka's quote: "Modern architects prefer to build glass facades. A misunderstood phrase of new objectivity has developed, apparently dominated by the belief that the more glass he uses, the more modern the architect becomes. The strange conclusion is that you can measure the modernity of an architect per square meter of glass. In Germany, a school was built, the glass facade of which had to be painted black on each floor from the floor to the ceiling, because otherwise one would not be able to read or draw in the classrooms. So not everything that is smooth is modern," end quote. Closedness, the compact cubic shape, the holes in the symmetrical axis, he took over from Loss's idea of an exterior design. The only place where he places a glass strip was a stairwell leading to a semi-open and semi-public courtyard, which you can see on the right side. On the top, there is a glass strip. The construction of Levenbach's house was completed in the early 1939, at a time when Heinrich Kulka would already be in emigration to London. The architectural historian Marie Benešová noticed that the Hradec Králové Levenbach's house, unlike Semler's residence in Pilsen, which is nicknamed the villa in an apartment building, looks more like a Loos villa, although it is an apartment building. The stepped facade the stepped exterior with the loggias and terraces leading from almost every apartment unit remind us of Loos's Šoj villa, Villa Šoj. However, this concept of compact stepped mass, which was enlarged to the dimensions that could accommodate an apartment building, was later elaborated by Loos himself and Kurt Unger into an unrealized design of a high-rise building or an apartment for Heinrich Jordan in Brno, which you can see on the right side. In this respect, Kulka followed Loos, for whom the family house, assembled into cubic mass, was the basic architectural shape. And in the case of the design of the collective housing construction, it only expanded and multiplied. Both projects show how Kurt Unger and Heinrich Kulka fulfilled developed and modified Lawes's principles. In the case of his parents' villa, Kurt Unger tried to implement Raumplan inside a longitudinally oriented house at the end of an urban row of buildings, while Kulka in Hradec Králové project tried to enlarge the Lawes's cascade cubic shape to the size of an apartment building. Heinrich Kulka intended his admiration for Lawes, his invocation of Lawes, and the extraction of Lawes's ideas, without a doubt, honestly. Although, as Poplar-Reuter points out, Kulka differentiated his relationship with Lawes at a later age and made it somewhat problematic, his 1970 confession can hardly be seen other than as a lifelong expression of fidelity. Quote, "When I stood at various crossroads of my road, Lawes's legacy always showed me the right way, so I was able to continue in that spirit," end quote. On the other hand, we must ask, what function did Kulka's vehement effort to construct and subsequently use an easy to remember one-word name for Lawes's distinctive conception of space, the Raumplan, what purpose did it serve after Lawes's death? Architectural historian Dietrich Worps, who has dedicated his research efforts to researching Raumplan and his second life, admits that Kulka's attempt to introduce Raumplan into the contemporary discourse and his not very convincing emphasis on economization of the domestic space has brought him visibility, fame, cultural gain, and economic capital. On the one hand, there is Kulka's ambition to create in the spirit of Adolf Loos, as you can see here, when he published some of his separate projects. Under this motto, he published, for example, the Semler's residence in Pilsen in one of the architectural journals after Loos's death. But on the other hand, we see considerable differences from Loos's spatial plans. Tanja Poplar-Reuter is inclined to believe that Kulka just wanted to modernize the Raumplan and make it accessible to a wider range of clients. However, Bořivoj Kriegerbeck, the builder of Miller's villa in Prague and another of Loos's collaborators, offers another perspective in his recently rediscovered diaries, namely that Kulka was simply unable to achieve Loos's results. Kriegerbeck writes on Kulka's expense, and I'm sorry, this will be quite a longer quotation, but I think it is very interesting. Quote, this is how Kriegerbeck reflected on Kulkas in his diaries. "He didn't have that much imagination, and sometimes I had to make his idea to look better than it actually was. He drew, and he drew well, but he did not excel in drawing. He was also influenced by Western architects, especially Corbusier, Ode, and Mies van der Rohe. So he started using large windows in their way, and this sometimes didn't pay off. So for the Semlers, in the large living hall, which you can see here, which was a little shorter than for Miller's, he made 2 large windows in the side wall, and so it happened that the space ran too wide. He tried to fix it by putting a large painting on the front wall that was deep, but that didn't fix much. Then we let the country windows be glazed with opaque glass, and we made a miniature garden between the country and the inner window. It was all patching. Naturally, only an expert knew it. While working for the Semlers, he designed a small weekend house under the Loos's name in Železná Ruda for a dentist, Dr. Teichner. When he was done on the paper, he called me to take a critical look at it. And he had a gallery there again. It wasn't bad, but Loos wouldn't have done it that way. He thought differently. I told Kulka this directly. Although both Kulka and Krieger were Loos's students and helpers, they did not explicitly accept his views. It's natural, but I don't think this is natural, but I don't think it was right to do it on his behalf or in his name. Loos, when he was doing something, had everything thought out in advance, as he said in his head. He saw the thing in his mind. He was walking through the apartment as if it was ready, as if it was already finished, just looking for someone to draw it for him, put it on paper, as he said. He did not shoot from the hip, or he did not improvise, end quote. Architectural historian Kenneth Frampton admits that despite Loss's use of free space, which he recognizes the most in Rufer's house, it was not spatial reduction, simplification, and economization, the very symptoms of modern thinking, but a creative manner, a quirk, a distinctive characteristic that is essentially anti-modern, that was essential to Adolf Loos. So how should the historiography of architecture cope with the fact that during the 1930s, the spatial economic potential of Raumplan was not fully developed in the realizations of most of Loos's pupils and successors, and was basically as a kind of ornamental, redundant form, or even a mannerism in Frampton's dictionary, reduced and disintegrated. When Adolf Loos died on August 23, 1933, in an Austrian sanatorium in Karlsburg, a large number of obituaries were published throughout Europe. In the 9th issue of the first year of Profil, Österreichische Monatsschrift für Bildende Kunst, which was devoted to the topic of light in architecture, the remarkable Loos's obituary was published by architect and editor Hans Adolf Wetter. The beginning is unconventional. Quote, Adolf Loos was a dramatist of fine arts. He avoided everything lyrical and idyllic, fascinated by the contrasts between his time and the generosity in his goals and his ideas, always aimed at resolving conflicts, end of quote. Wetter's interpretation of the discrepancy between Loos and the spirit of his time was truly original, quote. His fame is therefore incorrectly based on the dogmatization of the two ideals of materialism versus ornament, end quote. Wetter, unlike his contemporaries and Loos's colleagues and students, took the opportunity of an obituary to articulate criticism of Loos's architecture and, above all, the contradictions he saw within. Quote, unfortunately, the lack of exterior decoration is often compensated by the theatrical decoration of the rooms. The seemingly Puritan artist intoxicates the space with stairs and landings, niches, side passages and porches, intersections and open spaces, often sought after by symmetry. This decoration of the room is theatrical because, excluded from nature, it takes place only on the stage in the space of the room and, as in the theater, only in the glare of the spotlights, its existence begins and ends in the shadow of the walls. His country houses and villas thus remain in conflict with nature, end quote. As my colleague Jana Kořínková found out in the archives, Wetter's article was radically rejected in Loos's circle. Norbert Krieger described him as absurd, and a remarkable comment was made also by František Miller, the builder of the Villa Miller in Prague. He swept Wetter's criticism off the table for its, quote, cheeky tone. He wrote, quote, looking for an ornament in his spatial designs is ridiculous. Loos's landings, niches, intersections, and symmetries are guided by either practical or psychological reasons, end quote. This layer of interpretation of Raumplan as something ornamental was trampled by the generation of Kulka, Unger, or Krieger, who projected the ideas of reductionism into Loos's Raumplan. From a remarkable perspective, art historian Lada Hubatová-Vacková followed Wetter's critique of Loos's ornamental space in her book, The Silent Revolutions in Ornament. Hubatová-Vacková places Loos's conception of Raumplan in the context of contemporary theories of Konrad Fiedler, Siegfried Kratzauer, and Václav Nebeský, and comes up with an apt formulation of contradictions in Loos's architecture. Although he claimed to be anti-ornamentalist, his conception of space is inherently ornamental. Loss's Raumplan does not bring an efficient and economical solution to space, Hubatová-Vacková writes. On the contrary, it turns out that complex stairs routes and staged vistas are above all a kind of game of spatial forms, end quote. Hubatová-Vacková identifies Loss's ornamental concept of space with the term Raumkunst, introduced by a critic, Viennese critic Josef August Lux, where he used it for spatial designs by Loss's rival Josef Hoffmann, which he identified with the term visible music. So how do we think about Raumplan after Loss? In the late 1920s, Austrian-oriented discourse, a critic and art historian, Max Eisler, introduced a new spatial concept, which he defined as, quote, the pursuit of an intimate space with a form, referring to this space with a form as Raumform. If we don't like the notion of Raumkunst, which was proposed by Hubatová-Vacková, which is slightly distant to Loss's thinking because it contradicts Loss's belief that an architect is not an artist, we can start with Eisler. What was left of Raumplan in the project of Loss's successors was a space with an ornament, or a space with a manner, as Kenneth Frampton suggested, or a space with a form. Therefore, I would like to suggest this contemporary, although somewhat vague, Eisler's term of Raumform as an alternative. It is necessary to distinguish between a complex set of completely original qualities of a living space in projects in which Adolf Loos played a major creative role, and the derivative, possibly reshaped, synthesized, or simplified nature of the concept of space in Loos's pupils' designs in the 1930s, who were increasingly painfully confronted with the avant-garde and who either wanted to shift and update Loos's qualities, or who were simply unable to achieve Loos's results through an intuitive gesture, as Bořivoj Krýgerbeck suggests. So that would be all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ladislav. That's wonderful. I would encourage everybody to put their questions in the Q&A, and we have some minutes remaining in the hour. I can start off the conversation a little bit if while we wait for some questions to come in. It seems that the main question, while you haven't used the concept of style, is whether or not the Raumplan in Loos represents style in the way that we might think of it as an individual signature, like Frank Gehry's style, or style in the way Gideon might have wanted to use it, or that kind of tradition of art history which sees style as belonging to an epoch, a paradigm. And you used the idea of use phrases like spatial potential, and I think of space concepts in Gideon or something like that. And it seems that this question of whether or not Raumplan could transcend Loos and become something more of a historical style relates to a whole series of things that have changed in history from that moment to ours, to kind of generalize, to do with changing social attitudes, changing attitudes towards the rationalization of architecture and its role in a kind of socialist vision, attitudes towards accessibility. I mean, regulations probably wouldn't permit the Raumplan anymore. Our attitudes towards kind of just the general way we build and construct, or even to some degree, maybe there's something non-generalizable just about the geography. Loos was building in a dense urban city, whereas Neutra and Wright, I think, had the ability to spread out more and just build kind of horizontally. Yeah, and we could talk about each one of those, but I'm just
right.
Yeah.
So if Raumplan was a style is a very, I guess, important and important question, and it's something that we can sort of take from what I try to tell you today, because if we decide to think about Raumplan as a space with a form rather than some way of economization or some reduction of space, as Heinrich Kulka tried to propose in his 1930s texts, then yes, it can be seen as a style because it's something that brings a distinctive form into the domestic space, into the domestic interior. However, we also have to ask what do we mean by style? Because do we mean a personal style, or do we mean a style that is developed within a studio or a circle, or do we mean style as a zeitgeist? So I try to suggest that it could be seen as a personal style because it was something that we can find in Adolf Loss's houses, and most of the qualities of the spatial qualities or the formal qualities of Raumplan can be found only in Adolf Loss's projects, or the projects where Adolf Loss played the major creative part. Because if we are looking at the projects or the designs by Kurt Unger, Heinrich Kulka, Norbert Krieger, and other Adolf Loss's pupils, we can't see those qualities, or we can't see many of these qualities that we can find in Adolf Loss's designs. So that's what I meant by reducing or transforming the Raumplan concept within his pupils. So it can also be at some extent seen as a style in the sense of a style of a certain circle or a certain studio or a certain group of people surrounding the master. Because these ideas or these ideals were transmitted to the pupils. However, they were reduced. So what I was trying to say is we have to ask ourselves, what can we find in these projects that is derived from Adolf Loss, and what is not, and what is what are new impulses, what is it contaminated with, what is it even how some of the references stated, what is it intoxicated with. But I don't really think that we can really think about it as a style in the sense of zeitgeist, as something that spread it out and something that went from the top elite projects all the way down to nameless projects, or something that we can see, for example, in Frank Lloyd Wright's case.
I'm trying to bridge a little bit to our students, to our audience, who I think many of them will be in my current history class, which is their foundation second year students. And I'm just thinking about the kind of obvious question that I imagine might come to their mind. You know, if you're a young student listening to a rich lecture about buildings in the 1930s with complex level changes and fascinating kind of spatial qualities,
right?
You know, I think the question that would come to my mind is, can I still build like this today? You know, are there qualities that I see that I can learn from, and principles perhaps that I can extract? And then you come into conflict with these various kinds of questions. What is it about the horizon of my time as a student in the United States, right, 2010, right. that does or doesn't prevent me from building this spatial complexity? Like, you know, and then you start to realize what is unique about his horizon, historical horizon, in that place, in that time, and what has changed right. between there and now.
Right. So I think, at least for me, what is so fascinating about Loss's project, and especially his domestic interiors with the Raumplan concept, or with this concept of space, is that it is dead. It's something that is inherently modern. It was already anachronistic when he designed it in the 1930s. It is something of course, it was something very original. It was something quite new because he had a chance to build in this manner, and he found clients that were that wealthy that who could afford these projects. Later in his life, he was 60 when he designed, or 59 when he designed the Villa Miller and Villa Moller and the Tristan Tzara's house. And he died 4 years later. So it was already at the end of his life when he designed these houses that we talk about. And by that time, it was something he was trying to bring, and all these inequalities in that that he brought into the domestic life and into the functioning of the domestic interior of a family house. Were already something that he brought from the 19th century: the separation of the female space and the masculine space, the separation of the representative space and the private space, and so on, the public space in the house and the private space in the house, the separation of the representative space and sort of the functional space, like the kitchens and bathrooms and so on. So this was something that was already that was already anachronistic at that time. So it is only understandable that his pupils, who were supposed to succeed in the modern avant-garde world in 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, that they had to get rid of some of these ideas and some of these designs from Adolf Loos and transform it into something that would speak to the present world. So what is interesting about the Raumplan concept, and what is so intriguing for me and what I try to present today, is that at some extent it died with Adolf Loos, and at some extent it survived. So and what is in the interesting detective story is to find out what died with Adolf Loos and what survived with his pupils, and how they translated it, how they misunderstood it, because Heinrich Kulka's invention of the Raumplan concept was a huge misunderstanding what the Raumplan concept was all about. So that's something that is really interesting, and we always have to ask that the question for, especially for the design students and for the architecture students, is that the fact that something fascinates me, does it really mean that it can be used and it can be inspiring today? Which I think is not. Adolf Loos's work is fascinating, but let's leave it back in the early 20th century.
There's a very good question that follows up on what we're saying from Carrie Patterson. If Carrie would
Hello,
like
Carrie.
it.
We've been in touch recently, yeah.
You could ask it with your, yeah. You're
muted
at the moment.
Sorry about that. Hi.
Hello,
that was just fascinating, and it's a little bit of a leading question because I'm working with an author on a manuscript about an architect in France whose work is not known at all. He was an Austrian who ended up there, and so you know, from the examples I've seen, it's quite interesting, and the way that he translated Raumplan into some of these works that he did in France. And I'm just thinking maybe he's not the only one. He worked on the Tristan Tzara house with Loos. So yeah, isn't that worth exploring? You know, Loos had people come to Vienna and listen to his lectures, and I kind of feel like there's this diaspora of people who are interested in Loos that may have gone to other places in Europe, and there may be things that we don't even know about that can partly answer your question. You know, I think it's a wonderful question. Did it die with Loos? That's fascinating. I think that's worth concentrating on for years to come. So do you have any other ideas, you know, for where it could have gone?
Well, I'm sort of done with this research. I just wanted to raise this question and leave it to others, because I don't really do any systematic research on Adolf Loos. I just thought it might be interesting, and I wrote a piece about it recently. But there is a lot of research to be done on Adolf Loos, and not just theoretical research or arising like theoretical questions like this. There is a lot of archival research to be done, because of the nature of Adolf Loos's studios and circles, and of course his Jewish cooperators and Jewish clients. They had to leave Austria, they had to leave Central Europe, so their papers and their archives are spread literally all around the world: New Zealand, United States, Israel, and other countries. So it requires a lot of global research and a lot of global knowledge, globally fabricated knowledge, to really put the Loos's school back together, and to look at all these different pupils and all these different successors, and how they mythicized Adolf Loos, how they mythicized the legacy of Adolf Loos, how they exploited the time they spent with Adolf Loos, which is similar to also apprentices to Frank Lloyd Wright, how they exploited the time they spent with Adolf Loos in their later careers. So that's something that needs to be done in the future decades, I guess, and finding and researching all these forgotten figures, not only architects, but also engineers, clients, builders, contractors who worked with Adolf Loos and who had something to say about Adolf Loos's work and how Adolf Loos operated, and also the unique design, which is also something that Beatrice Colomina brings up to our attention. The unique, and also it was in the quotations I quoted by Boživoj Kriegerbeck and others, the very unique way Adolf Loos is designed, that he didn't really draw it on paper, but he only had it in his head, and he thought in three-dimensional way, is something, and others drew it for him. That's something that also raises the question of authorship and originality, and on all that kind of stuff, which is also a huge question when we re-research and when we reconsider the legacy of these big figures in architectural history. The authorship and originality meant something different with Frank Lloyd Wright, with Adolf Loos, with Le Corbusier, with even Frank O'Gary and others. So that's also something, and how it operated on a daily basis. What was the real commonplace of designing in Adolf Loos's studio is can bring us a lot of answers to what was his idea and how it manifested, and how it was perceived by others.
I wonder if I could sneak in one final question as well.
Sure, of course.
Which is just a kind of personal favorite. I love the reference to Colomina, and I was recently, reading the chapter you mentioned again, just like rereading it. And I think this might relate to the students in a different kind of way, not just how you relate to take inspiration from Loos's architecture, but also I think there's some very contemporary questions about subjectivity that are raised by Colomina's attempt to read his work in terms of voyeurism. And to help the students a little bit here, like she compares Loos and Le Corbusier as figures who are either have a humanist or a post-humanist idea of the subject. Le Corbusier comes out of the book as being still too humanist, whereas Loos is celebrated for fully embodying a post-humanist notion. And she imagines that this kind of, Ladislav, what you talked about is the theatrical quality of the architecture, enabling people who inhabit that space to be sort of split between being seen and seeing.
Right.
And she nests this reading in relation to the changes in media happening, particularly at that time. But this is where it's relevant to the students, because in our day and age, you know, the blurring between privacy and publicity with social media has like gone even further. So to what degree does, you know, so this idea of subjectivity, and also just to summarize this, you know, the idea that we are a certain kind of human being that is constructed in some way by our technology, our environment, our history. So our subjectivity might be a humanist subjectivity that we feel empowered and masters of our environment, or it might be a kind of post-humanist subjectivity where we feel displaced and without mastery. And Loos's architecture played a big role in the 1980s for theorists of architecture to say that we are becoming displaced, we have no mastery, we are kind of split characters because of our relationship to media. And so this is something that maybe we can extract from Loos, and it's still vibrant. You can still look at these questions of voyeurism in the architecture. I mean, it raises complicated questions like, does the architecture really embody that, or was it the projection of the theorist? You know, and if we were to, can we still create an architecture that produces subjectivity? I think that was one of the issues of that in the 1980s, that somehow you could actually encourage a split form of subjectivity in the way you design something. So I wonder if you have a view in it, to try and put that in a summary way, like on Colomina's reading, whether it belongs to the 1980s, whether it's still relevant. Is that kind of idea of subjectivity why we should look at Loos still today?
Well, definitely, because we still design our, well, the architecture and the architects design the domestic interiors and the private houses as a form of representation. So this way of thinking about architecture as representation is something that I think will never go away until we start building we start living in virtual reality more than in a physical world. So, and how it reflects the subjectivity, and how we can think about architecture as media, which is also another important question in Colomina's work, is I guess getting more and more up to date with all the social media, as you mentioned, and all the shift to the virtual world and cyber world, cyber networks, and what role does it play, and how the domestic interior that we inhabit and that we furnish and that represents us and that we represent manifests in all this, and how it relates to this media shift can be sort of similar to the media shift that she writes about when she writes about Loos and Corbusier, like the difference between the theater and the theatrical view and the movie view, or the movie sequence, as she refers to, like Corbusier's work. So yeah, but I'm a historian, so I can't really help you with what's happening in the contemporary world. What I can do is research archival documents and sort of try to raise questions. What can the historic architecture tell us about the past days and about what happened in the past, and how it is different than the present that we live in? That's I guess the most valuable lesson in history and art history and architecture history, is to differ how our living present is different from the past. The past people lived, and how they fabricated the past, and how they fabricated the structures of power, the functionality of the world, and etc. So to conclude this, I think Adolf Loos's architecture represents the main contradiction in Adolf Loos's architecture and his legacy, is that it represents both what was wrong with the modernist world and both what was right and what was productive and what was original about the modernist world.
That's a great conclusion. And I will end the event by just thanking you once again for a fascinating, like I said, very rich and full kind of historical account of a really key moment in architectural history. So thank you again, Ladislav. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming and attending, and have a great weekend.
You too.
And stay safe.